I can fix the code and save your ding contract because your people are out of depth.
How? You a janitor?
The hum of the floor polisher was the only rhythm Maya needed to drown out the echoes of a life she had been forced to leave behind. In the dead of night, the headquarters of Ethelgard Tech wasn't a temple of innovation. It was a mausoleum of glass and cold light. Maya moved through the 48th floor executive wing with the practiced invisibility of a ghost, her gray jumpsuit a shroud that rendered her non-existent to the few security cameras that bothered to swivel her way. To the world, she was just another set of hands emptying trash bins and wiping away the fingerprints of people who made more in a minute than she did in a year. But as she polished the mahogany desks, her eyes were doing more than looking for dust. They were debugging. She stopped at a workstation in the senior engineering bay. A crumpled piece of paper sat atop a recycling bin, covered in a frantic scrawl of C++ code for a thermal regulation subroutine. Maya didn't need to run a compiler to see the leak. The logic was as jagged and obvious as a broken window. She picked up a discarded pen, her hand steady. With 3 swift strokes, she refactored the loop, closing the memory leak that had clearly been haunting someone's 80-hour work week. She tossed the paper back into the bin and moved on. It was a compulsion she couldn't kill. Genius didn't go away just because your bank account hit zero. Moving toward the private suites, she entered the R&D lab, where a holographic projection of a neural network was suspended in the center of the room. It was stuttering, the light flickering with a persistent latency error. The engineers had been fighting it for weeks. Maya leaned her mop against the sterile workbench and stared at the shimmering nodes. Her mind unfolded the multidimensional geometry of the data, seeing the bottleneck where the others saw only noise. She reached into the projection, her fingers dancing through the light. She didn't change the architecture. She simply shifted the weight of 2 peripheral nodes, balancing the load with a mathematical elegance that was purely intuitive. The flickering stopped. The network smoothed out into a steady, golden glow. Maya stepped back, the light of the machine reflecting in her dark, tired eyes. She felt a brief, familiar spark of warmth in her chest, the high of a solved puzzle, before the reality of the 3 a.m. clock-in surged back. She grabbed her mop and moved toward the 50th floor, the penthouse office of Caleb Sterling. She had no idea that tonight, she wouldn't just be fixing a line of code or a flickering light. Tonight, she was going to walk into the lion's den and leave a footprint that would change the trajectory of the digital world. The 50th floor felt different from the rest of the building. It didn't smell of ozone and burnt coffee, but of cedar and quiet, terrifying ambition. This was Caleb Sterling's sanctuary, a glass box suspended above the sleeping city. Maya pushed her cleaning cart over the thick, silent carpet, her reflection ghosting across the panoramic windows. She was supposed to empty the bin, wipe the desk, and vanish. Then she saw the whiteboard. It was a massive slab of floor-to-ceiling glass, currently covered in a chaotic web of black ink. At its center was a single, monstrous equation, a quantum encryption proof that looked like a sprawling, dying star. This was the impossible equation, the heart of Ethelgard's billion-dollar defense contract. It was a masterpiece of complexity, but to Maya, it was a tragedy of errors. She stood frozen, the handle of her mop slick in her palm. Her eyes traced the variables, her brain automatically translating the symbols into a fluid language of logic. The senior architects had hit a wall. They had spent months trying to force the data through a linear bottleneck, unaware that the solution required a non-Euclidean approach. It was like watching a world-class orchestra play a symphony with a broken string. Maya looked toward the door. The security guard was 3 floors down, likely engrossed in a game on his phone. The building was silent. The city lights below flickered like a circuit board, beckoning her. "Don't do it," she told herself. "Empty the trash and leave. You are a ghost. Ghosts don't leave fingerprints." But the flaw in the third line was mocking her. It was a small, arrogant oversight, the kind of mistake made by a man who had never been forced to look at things from the bottom up. Her hand moved almost without her consent. She reached into her jumpsuit pocket and pulled out a dry erase marker she'd salvaged from the 42nd floor lounge. She didn't erase their work. She simply pivoted it. Her marker squeaked against the glass, a sharp, rhythmic sound in the vacuum of the office. She began at the center, weaving a new path through the variables, her handwriting small, precise, and hauntingly beautiful. She introduced a recursive loop that bypassed the hardware limitations, a solution so elegant it felt less like math and more like poetry. As she capped the marker, the board looked entirely different. The impossible equation had been solved, stripped of its bloat, and refined into its purest form. It was a key that could unlock any door in the digital world. Maya suddenly felt the weight of what she had done. She looked at the board, then at her own reflection in the glass. A woman in a faded gray jumpsuit, a janitor who had just handed the keys to the kingdom to the man who had destroyed her father. With a frantic pulse, she grabbed her cart and retreated into the shadows of the hallway, leaving the billion-dollar answer shining under the office lights. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when Caleb Sterling stepped off the private elevator, but the 50th floor was already vibrating with a panicked energy. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the air he breathed, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the disheveled state of the 3 senior engineers standing outside his office. It looked like they had seen a ghost or a god. Caleb ignored their stammering as he pushed open the heavy oak doors. He stopped dead. The glass whiteboard, which had been a graveyard of failed logic for 6 months, was now a map to a new era. The early morning light caught the fresh ink, making Maya's precise, elegant handwriting glow against the backdrop of the waking city. Caleb didn't move. He was a man who had built an empire on identifying value, and he knew instantly that what he was looking at wasn't just a solution. It was a revolution. It was the impossible equation, solved with a simplicity that made his own experts look like children. Who? Caleb's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Sir, we don't know, the head of R&D stammered, stepping into the room with his eyes glued to the board. We arrived for the 6 a.m. briefing and found it like this. None of the senior leads have clearance to be in here after midnight. We checked the logs. No one logged into the system. Caleb walked to the glass, his fingers hovering just inches from the ink. He could see the logic. It was breathtakingly nonlinear, a masterpiece of mathematical subversion. It was the kind of work his mentor, Marcus Vance, used to dream of. But Marcus was gone, his legacy buried under the weight of a scandal Caleb had helped facilitate. Check the physical security, Caleb commanded, his eyes narrowing as he caught a faint smudge on the carpet, a circular mark, the kind left by a heavy plastic bucket. Every camera, every sensor. I don't care if a bird flew past the window. I want to know who held this marker. The board of directors arrived shortly after, their usual corporate arrogance replaced by a stunned, greedy silence. They saw dollar signs. Caleb saw a threat. If someone could solve this, they could dismantle everything he had built. Sir, his lead security officer said, entering the room with a tablet in hand, his face pale. We've pulled the footage from the internal 50th floor corridor. You're not going to believe this. Caleb grabbed the tablet. The video was grainy, filtered through the infrared of the night vision setting. He watched as a woman in a shapeless gray jumpsuit, a mop bucket trailing behind her, stopped in front of the board. He watched her hand move with the certainty of a surgeon. A janitor? One of the directors hissed, leaning over Caleb's shoulder. That's impossible. It's a prank. A fluke. Caleb zoomed in on the woman's face as she turned to leave. Even through the digital noise, the intelligence in her eyes was piercing. It was a face he hadn't seen in 15 years, but one he recognized in his very bones. Find her, Caleb whispered, his grip tightening on the tablet until the screen groaned. Find her before she disappears, or I will burn this entire building to the ground with all of you in it. The security office was a cold, windowless box lined with screens, but the heat radiating from Caleb Sterling felt like a physical weight. He stood paralyzed as the head of security replayed the clip for the 10th time. The digital timestamp read 2:47 a.m. On the screen, the woman in the gray jumpsuit didn't look like a trespasser. She looked like a sovereign reclaim her throne. "Freeze it there," Caleb commanded, his voice barely a whisper. The image jolted to a halt. The woman had turned her head slightly as she reached for her cart, the infrared light catching the sharp, intelligent line of her jaw and the deep, soulful intensity of her eyes. Caleb felt a sickening jolt of recognition that started in his chest and turned his blood to ice. He reached out, his finger trembling as he touched the screen, tracing the curve of the face he had tried to forget for a decade and a half. "Enhance the facial geometry," he muttered. As the pixels smoothed out, the ghost became flesh. The software struggled with a low light, but it couldn't hide the heritage written in her features. She had Marcus Vance's brow, the same stubborn, defiant arch that had once loomed over Caleb in university lecture halls and boardroom battles. But the eyes were all her mother's, wide, observant, and filled with a quiet fire that had always looked right through Caleb's pretenses. "Maya," Caleb breathed, the name tasting like ash and old regret. "Sir?" the security officer asked, confused. The payroll records list her as Maya Woods. She's been on the night shift for 6 months. Background check was clean, no priors, high school diploma, no higher education on file. Because it was scrubbed, Caleb snapped, his mind racing through the wreckage of the past. Everything was scrubbed after the trial. Her father's assets, the university fellowships, the patents. She wasn't supposed to exist anymore. "I was told she'd left the country." He stared at the woman on the screen. Maya Vance, the daughter of the genius he had dismantled to build Ethelgard. He had thought he'd been merciful by leaving her with nothing but her life. But seeing her here, cleaning the floors of the empire built on her father's stolen foundations, was a special kind of hell. She hadn't just solved the equation. She had sent him a message. She was still here, and her mind was still a weapon more powerful than anything he had bought or stolen. "Where is she now?" Caleb demanded, turning on his heel, his eyes burning with a sudden, desperate hunger. "Is she still in the building?" "She clocked out of 5, sir. Her address is listed in the South District. It's a condemned block, Mr. Sterling. The eviction notices went out yesterday." Caleb didn't wait for the rest of the report. He was already out the door, the ghost of Marcus Vance's daughter haunting every shadow he passed. He hadn't just found a janitor. He had found the only person capable of destroying him, and he had to reach her before the rest of the world realized who was holding the marker. The South District smelled of wet concrete and broken promises, a place where the city's glitter was an urban legend. Maya stood on the cracked sidewalk, her fingers numb as she clutched the handle of a single frayed suitcase. At her feet lay the remnants of her life, a box of her grandmother's old books, a rusted kettle, and a stack of notebooks filled with calculations that no one would ever see. The landlord, a man with a face like a crumpled bill, stood in the doorway of the crumbling tenement, his arms crossed over a grease-stained shirt. "I told you, Woods. No pay, no stay." He spat, his eyes avoiding her steady, searing gaze. "The city's gutting this block by noon. Be grateful I let you keep the suitcase." Maya didn't beg. She had watched her father lose a kingdom without shedding a tear. She wouldn't lose her dignity over a 4-wall cell that leaked when it drizzled. She reached down to pick up the box of books, but the sound of an approaching engine made her pause. It wasn't the rattling roar of a local bus. It was a low, synchronized hum, the sound of refined, expensive power. 3 obsidian black SUVs rounded the corner, their polished surfaces reflecting the grime of the alley like a middle finger to the neighborhood. They moved with the surgical precision of a military escort, coming to a silent, predatory halt directly in front of the trash-strewn curb. The neighborhood went still. Even the landlord took a step back into the shadows of the doorway. The door of the center vehicle opened. A pair of handmade leather shoes met the uneven asphalt, followed by a man who looked like he had been cut from a different reality. Caleb Sterling stepped into the gray light of the South District, his sharp suit and silver-tipped tie a violent contrast to the peeling lead paint behind him. Maya didn't move. She stood among her scattered belongings, the wind whipping a stray lock of dark hair across her face. She felt the sudden, frantic beat of her heart, but she forced her expression into a mask of cold iron. She knew that suit. She knew that walk. Caleb's eyes swept over the scene. The eviction notice taped to the door, the pathetic pile of her life on the sidewalk, and the woman who looked him in the face with the same terrifying intelligence he had seen on the security footage. The arrogance in his posture faltered for a fraction of a second when his gaze met hers. "Maya," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stagnant air. "You're early for the trash pickup, Mr. Sterling," Maya replied, her voice low and dangerous. She didn't look at the motorcade or the guards. She looked at the man who had helped erase her father from history. "But as you can see, the landlord already took out the garbage for you." Caleb took a step toward her, his eyes fixed on the notebooks spilling out of her box. "I saw the board, Maya. I know it was you. Then you know enough to stay away from me," she snapped, reaching for her suitcase. "I solved your problem, or even for the 6 months of floors I cleaned. Leave." But Caleb didn't move. He stood in the wreckage of her world, a billionaire in a graveyard, realizing that the most powerful mind in his company was currently homeless because of a debt he had helped create. The silence between them stretched, thick with the smell of exhaust and the heavy weight of history. Caleb looked at the battered cardboard box near Maya's feet, his eyes lingering on a handwritten theorem peeking out from the pages of a notebook. He knew that the scribbles on that cheap, lined paper were worth more than the entire block they were standing on. "I'm not here to talk about the floors, Maya," Caleb said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced persuasion. He took another step forward, encroaching on her small island of salvage belongings. "The board of directors is in a state of shock. They think a ghost solved the encryption proof. I know better. I know you're the only person alive who could have navigated that architecture." Maya's grip on her suitcase handle tightened until her knuckles turned the color of bone. "I didn't do it for them, and I certainly didn't do it for you. I did it because the math was insulting. It was a sloppy, arrogant mess, just like everything else Ethelgard puts its name on." Caleb didn't flinch at the venom in her tone. Instead, he straightened his cuffs, the gold links glinting in the dull morning light. "Then help me fix it. Come back to the building. Not as a ghost, and certainly not with a mop. I'm offering you a seat at the senior executive table. Chief of Quantum Research. You'll have a budget in the hundreds of millions, a lab that makes NASA look like a middle school science fair, and a salary that will ensure you never have to stand on a sidewalk like this again." He gestured toward the idling SUVs, a silent promise of a different life. "Your father's name. I can't erase the past, but I can put his daughter where she belongs." At the top, Maya let out a short, hollow laugh that contained no mirth. She looked at the man who had stood by while her father's patents were stripped and his reputation was fed to the wolves. Caleb Sterling wasn't offering her a seat. He was offering her a golden leash. "You want to put me where I belong?" Maya stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying brilliance. "I've spent 6 months cleaning your toilets, Caleb. I've seen the way your brilliant minds work when they think no one is watching. You don't want a partner. You want a miracle worker to save a dying contract because you've realized your own people are out of their depth." She reached into her pocket, pulled out the plastic ID badge she had used to clock in for a shift, and dropped it onto the cracked asphalt. "I quit," she said, her voice flat and final. Caleb frowned, his composure finally slipping. "You haven't even started the new position, Maya. Don't be foolish. You have nothing. No home, no resources. I have the solution to the next 3 phases of your project. Maya interrupted, a predatory smile touching her lips as she saw his eyes widen. I solved the board, Caleb, but I didn't write down the key to the integration. It's all up here. She tapped her temple. So, consider this my resignation from Ethelgard Tech. If you want the rest of the proof, you'll have to do more than offer me a chair at a table you stole from my family. The standoff on the sidewalk was shattered not by words, but by the sudden, violent screech of tires from the opposite end of the alley. A nondescript gray van, devoid of markings or plates, drifted around the corner with a reckless momentum that sent trash cans flying. It didn't slow down as it approached Caleb's polished motorcade. It accelerated, its sliding door already halfway open. Maya saw them first. Her hyper-analytical mind processed the scene in milliseconds. The heavy tactical boots of the men inside, the matte black finish of the specialized hardware they carried, and the way they ignored the billionaire to focus entirely on her. These weren't corporate litigators. They were mercenaries from Sovereign Dynamics, Ethelgard's most ruthless competitor. They didn't want to buy her genius. They wanted to extract it. Maya, get down, Caleb shouted, his hand reaching for her arm, but she was already moving. Years of living in the shadows had taught her that the center of the street was a death trap. She dove behind the rusted carcass of a dumpster just as a pressurized canister hissed through the air. A cloud of thick, white sedative gas erupted where she had been standing seconds before. Caleb's security detail reacted with clinical precision, drawing their weapons and forming a defensive perimeter around their CEO. But the mercenaries weren't interested in a shootout with a billionaire. They were a snatch-and-grab team. 2 men in gas masks leapt from the van, ignoring the warning shots fired by Caleb's lead guard. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized speed toward Maya's hiding spot. One of them held a high-voltage stun baton that crackled with a lethal blue light. "You're worth more than the company, Ms. Vance," one of the masked men growled, his voice distorted by his respirator as he rounded the dumpster. Maya didn't freeze. She reached into her box of books, her fingers closing around the rusted kettle she had packed moments ago. As the mercenary lunged, she swung the heavy iron with a desperate, calculated force, catching him square in the mask. The plastic shattered, and he grunted, stumbling back into the gas cloud. But there were more coming. The alley was becoming a choke point of gas and gunfire. Caleb, shielded by his men, was trying to reach her, his face pale with a terror that wasn't for his own life. He realized with a sickening clarity that the world now knew what he knew. Maya Vance was the most valuable asset on the planet. In the car. "Now!" Caleb roared, breaking away from his guards to reach for her hand. Maya looked at the black SUV, then at the Mercs closing in. The gray jumpsuit she wore was stained with the district's grime, but as she took Caleb's hand and leaped into the reinforced vehicle, her eyes remained fixed on the notebooks she had been forced to leave behind on the asphalt. The war for the future had officially moved from the whiteboard to the streets. The black SUV tore away from the South District, the armored glass vibrating with the dull thud of a final, desperate projectile from the mercenaries. Inside the vehicle, the silence was heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of Maya's breathing. She sat as far from Caleb as the leather interior allowed, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. She wasn't a victim being rescued. She was a power player who had just survived a hostile takeover. Caleb watched her, his heart still hammering against his ribs. He waited for the fear to set in, for the thank you that never came. Instead, Maya turned to him, her eyes as cold as the quantum processors she had been fixing in secret. "I'm not going to your senior executive suite," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the engine. "And I'm not signing your standard employment contract. If I enter that building, it won't be as your employee. It will be as an independent consultant with total autonomy." Caleb opened his mouth to argue. The board would never approve such a lopsided arrangement, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She had seen him vulnerable. She had seen his empire nearly lose its greatest prize to a van and a gas canister. Terms? He asked, his voice low. My own lab. Off network. Isolated from your department heads. No one enters without my thumbprint, including you, Maya stated, ticking points off on her fingers with clinical precision. And the culture changes. No more 80-hour weeks for the junior leads. No more burn insurance staffing. I want the names of every engineer your board has squeezed for patents and then discarded. We're going to pay them back, Caleb, starting with my father's estate. Caleb leaned back, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. He had invited a shark into his fish tank, and she was already planning how to drain the water. You're asking me to dismantle the very structure that made Ethelgard a leader. I'm asking you to make it a company that deserves the math I'm about to give it, Maya countered. 3 hours later, the elevator doors of the 50th floor opened. The staff stood in stunned silence as the janitor from the night shift walked out, dressed in her same stained jumpsuit, but flanked by Caleb Sterling himself. She didn't head for the cleaning closet. She walked straight to the R&D wing, her presence a silent detonation. As she reached the door of the new high-security lab, she stopped and turned to the room of gaping executives. By the way, she said, her voice ringing out across the floor, the coffee on the 42nd floor is acidic enough to dissolve lead. Fix it. We have real work to do. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. The light turned green, and the door hissed shut, leaving the corporate world outside. Maya Vance was no longer a ghost. She was the architect of a new, uncomfortable reality. The hum of the servers in Maya's private lab was a low, meditative thrum, a stark contrast to the aggressive silence of the executive wing. She sat before a panoramic array of monitors, her fingers flying across the keys as she peeled back the digital scar tissue of Ethelgard's history. She wasn't looking for encryption keys anymore. She was looking for a ghost. Caleb had given her the keys to the kingdom, but she knew that even a king doesn't act alone. To find the truth about her father's downfall, she had to look at the ghost logs, the deep layer metadata that tracked every authorization and every whisper of a deleted file from 15 years ago. The data was a tangled thicket of shell companies and redacted memos, but Maya's mind moved through the complexity with the ease of a predator. She tracked the original patent filing for the quantum core, her father's life's work, and followed the digital breadcrumbs of its theft. She expected to find Caleb's signature at the end of the trail, the final stroke that had signed Marcus Vance's professional death warrant. Instead, she found a shadow. Deep within a corrupted archive, she recovered a series of encrypted communications sent from an internal terminal during the peak of her father's trial. The sender wasn't Caleb Sterling. It was Arthur Penhaligon, the senior chairman of the board, the man who currently sat at the head of the table, projecting an image of grandfatherly stability while Caleb took the heat for the company's ruthlessness. Maya leaned into the screen, the blue light reflecting in her widened eyes. The log showed that Caleb had actually tried to stall the patent seizure. He had been the one to authorize the secret payouts to her mother for the first few years, disguised as administrative errors. It was Penhaligon who had discovered the leak, shut down the funds, and leaked the fabricated evidence of fraud that had finally broken her father's spirit. Caleb hadn't been the architect of the ruin. He had been the pawn who inherited the wreckage. He had spent a decade playing the villain to keep the company from collapsing under Penhaligon's true, darker greed. The realization hit Maya with the force of a physical blow. The rage she had carried for 15 years, a fire fueled by the image of Caleb Sterling as the sole destroyer of her world, suddenly flickered. She looked at the door of her lab, knowing Caleb was just a few hundred feet away, likely sitting in his office, carrying the weight of a sin he hadn't fully committed. She wasn't just a consultant anymore. She was a witness. And the real enemy wasn't the man in the CEO's chair. It was the man pulling the strings from the shadows of the board. Maya closed the terminal, her expression hardening into something sharper than math. It was time for a new kind of calculation. The boardroom was a cathedral of cold glass and silent judgment, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken threats. Arthur Penhaligon sat at the head of the mahogany table, his silver hair catching the morning light as he smoothed the lapels of his suit. He looked every bit the elder statesman of tech, a facade that had held for 15 years. "The board is losing patience," Caleb Penhaligon said, his voice a smooth paternal purr. "This consultant of yours has been locked in her lab for 72 hours. We have a contract to fulfill, or we have a vacancy in the CEO's office to fill." Caleb stood by the window, his back to the room. He didn't look at the board. He looked at the reflection of the door as it swung open. Maya walked in, but the janitor's jumpsuit was gone. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal silk, her presence radiating a calculated, lethal intelligence that stopped the breathing of every director in the room. She carried a single silver tablet, which she slid across the table until it stopped directly in front of Penhaligon. "The consultant is finished," Maya said, her voice a low, steady chime. Penhaligon sneered, glancing at the screen. "And what is this? More quantum theory? We need results, Ms. Woods, not riddles." "It's not a riddle," Arthur, Caleb said, finally turning around. There was a lightness in his posture that hadn't been there for a decade. "It's a forensic reconstruction of the 2011 patent seizure. Specifically, the offshore accounts used to funnel the Vance Estate's royalties into a private trust in the Cayman Islands." The color drained from Penhaligon's face, leaving it a waxen mask of horror. He looked down at the tablet. It wasn't math on the screen. It was a digital map of his own greed. Transaction IDs, decrypted emails, and the ghost logs Maya had pulled from the machine. "You spent 15 years letting me take the blame for your theft," Caleb continued, stepping toward the table. "While I try to keep this company afloat, you were cannibalizing its heart. Maya didn't just solve the equation, Arthur. She solved you." The board members, sensing a shift in the wind, began to pull away from Penhaligon like he was radioactive. Maya stepped to the head of the table, her hand resting on the back of the chair that had once belonged to the man who ruined her father. As of 5 minutes ago, Maya stated, her eyes locked on Penhaligon's, "The SEC and the Federal Bureau have received the full unredacted file. Ethelgard Tech is under a state-ordered restructuring, and per the emergency bylaws, the board is appointing an interim leader who actually understands the technology we're protecting." Penhaligon looked around the room, finding only the cold, hard eyes of the woman he had tried to erase. He stood up, his legs trembling, and walked out of the room without a word, followed by 2 security officers Caleb had stationed at the door. Caleb looked at Maya, an unspoken apology and a newfound respect passing between them. He didn't sit down. Instead, he gestured to the head of the table. Maya took her seat. She looked out at the city she had spent 6 months cleaning up after, and for the first time in 15 years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She was the face of the future, and she was just getting started.